I want to know your thoughts of what's in the Epstein files, which you may believe, and why hasn't it been fully released yet?
Don't know, don't care, but I have suspicions. See, Epstein's file is a distraction from something we ought to be paying more attention to.
Okay.
What's likely to be going on with Epstein is simply this. Humans have a huge sex drive. And all throughout history, from Cleopatra being rolled up naked in a carpet and carried by a slave to be dropped at Caesar's feet, all the way up to Mata Hari in World War I, you've had the intelligence network rely upon the human sex drive to acquire information. So when you have Epstein, I imagine what you have is somebody attempting to do two things. One, acquire the typical intelligence industry type information, and two, deal with the Hollywood entertainment communications industry leverage by getting blackmail information on people and also relying on somebody's personal freak. That's what you got with Diddy. What Diddy was doing is essentially he was running the pimp game, or what you see in the porn industry, under a set of statutes, the Mann Act, that were created to get Jack Johnson, the first black world heavyweight champion from before World War I, who had a white wife and was causing the white community a lot of grief by running around with a group of white women all over the country. So the FBI was created to come up with the Mann Act and get Jack Johnson. So they did, and he wound up doing 1 year, and he escaped, and he wound up doing several times more time because he escaped and he got for the sentence. So you've got all this mess on Diddy with what essentially is a 1 year, 1.5 year case that they treated like it was a major felony. And it relied upon the dynamic now, feminism pushing what they do. And it also illustrates another point, by the way. I understand the position of the ladies, and it's not right to do it. But the statute of limitations on a homicide to bring a civil action is between 1 and 2 years all across America. One of your loved ones is wrongfully killed, and whether or not there is a criminal charge brought to bring a civil charge and get damages, you have 1 or 2 years. But for a booty pinch or a titty squeeze, you got 35, 50 years worth of statute of limitations, because the feminist movement has said that's more critical and important than killing somebody. Wow. So it gets a little warped when you start dealing with what we used to call boutique criminality. In other words, the latest fashion in crime, either commission or prosecution. And by the way, the whole thing with the criminal bit is no longer about crime and what the criminal justice system is supposed to be doing relative to that. The criminal justice system is morphed into a labor control device. When you have a glut in a labor market, it's the same as having a glut in a commodity market. So the responses are the same. There are 3. You store the surplus, cut back production, and subsidize the would-be producer. We store the surplus in a jail cell instead of a grain silo. The subsidy is a welfare check or the Section 8 situation that becomes permanent rather than temporary. And cutting back a production is where rap, some other stuff comes in, where you put the wrong kind of ideation in the young male's head. So instead of being a productive, brave, and courageous person, he becomes dependent, perceives himself to be entitled to this dependency. He does not develop a vocational skill, educational or academic acumen. He develops the wrong way of carrying himself. He bangs out, drugs out, drops out. The young girls get knocked up too early, too often. Where they live become hellholes and cesspools, islands of dysfunction, so the people that live there cannot effectively engage in the political process for collective self-help, and it's a hell of a mess, and ordinary Americans are more worried about getting ripped off walking to their carports than they are about defective economic policy delivered by the people that they elect, who have other agendas, which is to push this ideology. And they don't want people locked up for their free labor. They want them locked up to prevent them from laboring. And the labor that they give them is simply idle minds mischief makes. So you give them something to do, make license plates or make blue jeans, and that keeps them out of mischief. You don't want to rehab them, because if they get rehab, they glut the labor market. You are supposedly bringing in cheap labor by having illegal immigrants in, but the real deal comes out if you read Article 1 to the Constitution. Every 10 years, there's a census, the primary purpose of which is to apportion representatives in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., that is in Congress. So that's why there is this big thing developing about why is the last census for 2020 the first one in a century where they did not ask whether or not you were a citizen. Why? It's not like some people talk about they want illegals to come in and vote. Hell no, they don't want you to vote. They want you to be counted and not able to vote. So what winds up happening is California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Michigan don't lose congressmen, but keep them and maybe gain one or two. And the people that make that count go up can't vote, but the same old people get to vote. It's like what you get with also Section 1, Section 8. The Constitution never said black folk were 3/5 of a human. It just says for purposes of apportioning representation in the House of Representatives, 3/5 of all those held in involuntary servitude or slavery shall be counted toward that number. So what you have is illegals brought in who can't vote in their entirety. They're counted toward that number. Now, there's another caveat to that that is a fallback alternative. Had Hyena Harris won and gotten in with Waltz, the president, being the chief executive officer and chief diplomatic officer for the United States by the Constitution, would have had the authority to have declared the people that came in illegally to be politically refugees and to grant them asylum. She could have set a retroactive date, which would have been probably coincidental with her taking office in January 2020. What that meant is you kick in an American law that says a person who is granted asylum doesn't have to go through the usual stages to become a citizen. They automatically become a citizen in 5 years from the point of the grant of asylum. So that would have meant that 5 years from 2020, which is right now, these people would have now in the second year of her, going into the second year of her term, they would have been declared U.S. citizens who could have voted and might have voted in gratitude to the Democratic Party for letting them in. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Iran, and North Korea, the People's Republic of China, and a lot of folk that don't like us don't have to go infiltrate the country, hijack airplanes, and crash them into Twin Towers. They could walk across the border without anybody checking them with military-grade explosives in their backpacks, emplace them, and await further instructions, and they don't have to kill themselves to do the damage, just flip the switch. And meanwhile, the American intelligence community is issuing a stern warning that there is a very high likelihood that there will be some terrorist activity on a multi-state basis that will put 911 to shame. It's already in place, and there's very little we can do about it except try to put ourselves in a position to pick the pieces up. So I think it is rank stupidity to violate the sanctity of the American borders and letting these folk that want to kill us and are angry as the devil because they don't have B-52s, B-1s, or B-2 strategic bombers to go blast them all the way over, 16 hours away from the United States, who launches B-2s from Montana.
Right.
So it's stuck on stupid dumb, and it's typical of idiots who have an ideology that does not require them to think through things. And that's where we are in terms of our overall perspective. But trust me, right now, what you see going on is pale in comparison to what happened with the 60s. And when I studied what happened back in the 20s and teens, it was a lot worse than that. And then talking to my grandfather, who was a grown man when it was going on, what was happening in terms of the violence in the South of the United States in the 1870s and 1880s is awful. My grandfather on my mother's side, he was born before the Civil War. He wound up becoming a physician, but he and two of my uncles had to flee the South, or the area in the South where they were, because they murdered two deputy sheriffs for, they thought, participating in the lynching of another uncle. So I remember news articles I got a hold of from around here from 100 years ago, 125 years ago, and it said up here in Fayette County, the dastardly Klansmen with sheets over their heads were intimidating the colored, but the colored ranks contained veterans from the Great War, and they armed themselves, and when the night riders appeared, they quickly emptied 11 saddles, and the masked cowards promptly fled their intended colored targets. So it was not that these things didn't happen, but we just focus on victimhood, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Black Wall Street. That's a damn shame, because simultaneously with that, there were incidents in, I think, 122 other places in America between 1918 and the early 1920s. Where
are you talking about the Red Summer of 1919? The summer of the Red Summer of 1919. Yeah.
Yeah, but you see, the interesting thing is the biggest one was in Washington, D.C. It lasted most of a business week, and they had to send in the cavalry to break it up. But there was a Black Veterans Convention, and these guys who had just gotten back from the trenches in France, they got some guns that some Black Pullman car porters had smuggled in from Baltimore, got on the roof, started sniping at the people that were trying to lynch colored folk. And interestingly enough, more white people died than Black people did. But you see, we don't talk about that. We talk about Tulsa. And the interesting thing about Tulsa is not one item of Black property got burnt or destroyed, because the Blacks didn't have any real property ownership. Everything was leased from the Native Americans. So it's a thing in Tulsa that they focus on, but it's the wrong place to focus on, because there's too much wrong with the situation. It's not a place where blacks own real property, owned the property rights to the lands where the banks were located, owned the property rights to the buildings where the banks were located and the industry was located. They were leasing all of that. And they should arm themselves a little bit more, like they did in other places in the country, or the Black veterans did in D.C. So the message from that is in America, nobody gets anything for being passive. You have to stand up and be willing to die for it. And we died for suicidal purposes, but not for purposes of achieving, demanding, or securing the rights and prerogatives that go with being free. We depend on somebody to give it to us because they owe it to us, rather than get the hell out of my way. I'm taking it. That's the American way. And that's how we approach politics. Like good massa will get the kibbles and bits open for us, so let's go vote for them, rather than voting for somebody that's saying you're addicted to that poisonous situation, so get over it. I'm going to make you cold turkey the stuff, so you'll have to do what other men and women around the world do. If they aren't in a totalitarian situation, they have to depend on themselves. You need to be able to as well. And frankly, I don't like the welfare situation that is developed in this country, where so many people are dependent upon it. And quite frankly, though I freely admit I love sex, I don't want to pay for somebody flat backing and enjoying sex indiscriminately and getting paid for the results. I don't want to pay them to have the benefits. They need to be able to support themselves.